At 4 o'clock hours on February 7, 1945, Corporal James Theodore Mackenzie crouched in a shell crater about 200 yards behind the American lines near Bastogne, Belgium. The cold was vicious, relentless. The thermometer had sunk to 14 degrees below zero, the kind of cold that stole your breath and made fingers feel like they belonged to someone else. Clutched in his gloved hands, a dented canteen cup held a crude mixture of axle grease and diesel fuel, sloshing faintly as he stirred it with a screwdriver. The plan he had meticulously devised over the past 3 weeks seemed insane. Impossible. And yet, in Mackenzie's mind, it was the only chance to stop the steel monsters rolling toward their lines. At just 22 years old, with 11 months of combat already etched into his face and 2 Purple Hearts pinned to his chest, Mackenzie had learned one hard truth: the war didn't reward patience or caution. It rewarded ingenuity, decisiveness, and a willingness to embrace risk when everything else had failed. He had watched the German Tiger tanks in horror over the past month. The monstrous vehicles, with frontal armor up to 180 mm thick, shrugged off bazooka rounds like mere irritations. American tank destroyers could barely dent them, and Sherman crews, well, Mackenzie had seen them wiped out, one after another, their tanks shredded before they even had a chance to aim properly. Behind him, Sergeant Frank Holloway shifted uneasily, arms crossed, eyes scanning the horizon as though willing the younger man's plan to dissolve into common sense. "You're wasting your time, Mac," Holloway said, his voice a rasp against the frozen wind. "We need you on the machine gun, not playing chemist with kitchen supplies." Mackenzie didn't look up. He'd been thinking about this for weeks. Ever since he had seen a Tiger tank casually shrug off 6 bazooka rounds in a matter of seconds, he had begun to calculate alternatives. This was no mere hunch, it was mechanical analysis combined with the intuition born of living in northern Minnesota, where winter temperatures regularly plunged to 40 below. He knew what happened to machinery when lubricants froze. He knew what happened to moving parts when the grease hardened in extreme cold. "You think anyone's going to let us try it?" Holloway asked, skepticism threading his words. "That's the problem," Mackenzie muttered. He glanced down at the mixture in the canteen cup. "We don't need permission. We need results." The Battle of the Bulge had been raging for 53 brutal days, with the Germans pressing their advantage, sending wave after wave of infantry and armor toward the American positions. Intelligence reports had warned of an 8 Tiger push aimed directly at their sector. If even half reached their positions, it could mean death for the entire company. Mackenzie's mind played through the statistics as he stirred the mixture again. 1 Tiger could destroy 5 Shermans before taking significant damage. That math was not just brutal, it was lethal. And the German crews knew it. The Americans knew it. Morale was bleeding out, one mangled foxhole at a time. For days ago, Mackenzie had witnessed the horrifying precision of these armored behemoths. A Tiger had parked itself 300 yards from their line, seemingly invincible. For 2 hours, it methodically demolished machine gun nests, mortar pits, and supply dumps, each shot a calculated message of dominance. When it finally withdrew, 14 American soldiers lay dead, forward positions flattened. That night, huddled in his frostbitten cot, Mackenzie began thinking about axle grease. Now, Holloway's skeptical eyes were fixed on the dented canteen. "And you plan to do what, exactly? Pour it into the turret?" "No," Mackenzie said, finally lifting his gaze. "I'll spray it on the turret ring." Holloway's brow furrowed. "You're insane. That gap's tiny. That's the bearing, the turret bearing. If you get anywhere near it, you'll be crawling under a tank that can crush you without thinking twice." Mackenzie nodded, understanding the magnitude of the risk. "Exactly. But if I can get the mixture into that gap, it'll seep down into the bearing race, mix with the grease, and when the temperature drops tonight, it'll freeze solid. Turret won't rotate. Firepower gone. 1 tank neutralized. Maybe more, if the cold does its work." The sergeant shook his head, staring at the ruined landscape, the frozen bodies and splintered wood of American defenses. You'd have to get within 10 yards of a Tiger. Stay there long enough to coat the turret ring while German infantry sweeps the area. You'd have to survive. And then, pray it works. You'd be gone before anyone knew you were there. I know, Mackenzie said quietly. But it's the only shot we have. I've worked the ratios, the timing, the penetration. It's the only way. Holloway sighed, the wind cutting across the crater. Get your supplies ready. Move at 0600. German armor usually hits at 0730. That gives you 90 minutes. By 5:45, Mackenzie moved through the pre-dawn darkness, carrying his rifle, 4 glass bottles filled with the frozen grease mixture, and a hand-pump spray canister liberated from the battalion aid station. The American forward line was 200 yards ahead. Beyond that, no man's land stretched another 300 yards toward the German positions. He needed cover along the expected Tiger advance route. He needed a shell crater or a ruined building where he could remain unseen until the perfect moment. By 6:15, he found a partially destroyed farmhouse, its roof collapsed but cellar intact. Sliding into the rubble, Mackenzie positioned himself near the hole in the cellar wall overlooking the road. From here, the German Tigers would pass within 20 yards, close enough to strike, close enough to die. At 7:23, the rumble came. Engines, deep and guttural, shaking the frozen ground. Tiger tanks. Maybach HL-230 engines, 12 cylinders, 690 horsepower, pushing 56 tons at 24 miles per hour on roads, slower cross-country. Mackenzie's calculations went into overdrive. Weak points, vulnerabilities, timing, everything he had studied for weeks converged into the next 30 seconds of action. The first Tiger rolled past at 7:30, engine grinding, turret rotating, commander scanning the horizon. Infantry followed behind, 40 soldiers at least. Mackenzie stayed still. The first tank wasn't enough. He needed multiple targets. Needed proof that his gamble could affect more than one vehicle. Seconds later, the second Tiger appeared. Then a third. And a fourth. 5 Tigers in total, strung along the road, crushing earth and morale beneath their tracks. Mackenzie counted them carefully, noting speed, distance, and the dispersion of infantry. Timing was everything. Wait until the last squad of German infantry passed, move while they were distracted. He would have one chance to implement the plan. One chance to alter the course of the attack. Creeping out of the cellar, Mackenzie carried his spray canister, moving low through the broken terrain. 50 yards. 40. 30. 20. The Tiger's engine roared, covering his movements. 10 yards. Exhaust hot on his face. Crawling under the massive machine. He aimed the spray canister at the turret ring and began pumping. The mixture sprayed out in a fine mist, seeping into the bearing. 3 bottles emptied, then the fourth. 70% of the circumference covered, enough, he hoped, to disable the turret. Dropping the canister, he began retreating, a German voice shouted. Mackenzie rolled behind rubble, fired, dropped 2 soldiers, then ran toward the American lines. The Tiger's assault began in earnest. Shells screamed, gunfire shredded the landscape. And somewhere, in that chaos, the frozen grease was taking hold. At 8 o'clock, Mackenzie returned to the American lines. Holloway approached, awe in his eyes. The fourth Tiger, the one he had coated, was immobile. Turret frozen. Commander shouting orders that could not be executed. Temperature dropping, crystallizing the grease further. One tank neutralized, and the war of mechanics and ingenuity had begun. For the first hour, Mackenzie didn't speak. He watched as his gamble unfolded, a single man's desperate experiment shaking the advance of one of the most fearsome machines of the war. 4 out of 5 Tigers would eventually seize up, the Germans unable to comprehend the sudden mechanical failures. Without turret mobility, the tanks were steel coffins. American forces began firing from prepared positions, halting the German advance. Mackenzie's frozen grease trick had worked. By noon, the battalion understood what had happened. Mackenzie's daring, his risk, his ingenuity, had stopped the armored advance. Corps intelligence wanted to replicate the mixture across other units. Mackenzie cared little for accolades. He cared only that his squad survived, that lives were spared by the strange alchemy of grease and diesel, frozen under a Belgian winter sky. By 12:30, the snow-covered fields outside Bastogne had become a chaotic tapestry of war, steel, fire, and ice. The German advance had ground to a halt, not by sheer numbers or brute force, but by the meticulous, almost absurd ingenuity of one young corporal from Minnesota. Mackenzie's gamble, the frozen grease mixture sprayed into the turret ring of the 4th Tiger, had proven the concept worked. But the battle was far from over, the remaining Tigers were faltering. The 5th Tiger, the one he had not sprayed directly, was moving sluggishly, its turret grinding against the contaminated bearing grease. Mackenzie watched through the smoke and snow from the relative cover of a crater, breathing shallow, trying not to give himself away. His rifle rested across his knees, fingers trembling not from fear alone but from the bitter cold that bit through his gloves. He had survived the most dangerous part, crawling within mere yards of a Tiger tank, but that did not mean the danger had passed. Holloway approached, careful, alert. "It's working," he said softly, almost in disbelief. "The others, look at them. They're freezing up." His voice carried a mix of relief and astonishment. "I've never seen German armor stall like that, not even from direct hits." Mackenzie nodded. "It's not the shots. It's the cold. The grease. Once it crystallizes, there's nothing they can do to move the turret." He felt a grim satisfaction, tempered by the knowledge that the Germans' infantry still pressed forward, using the immobilized Tigers as cover. One misstep, one bullet, and he could still die. Across the frozen landscape, the Tigers began to experience mechanical havoc. The 2nd Tiger's turret slowed, faltering slightly, its crew struggling to engage targets. Mackenzie watched, analyzing every movement, calculating every potential outcome. By 9:45, the 3rd Tiger had completely seized, its turret locked solid. The crew frantically tried to operate the hydraulics, banging levers and pulling on mechanisms, but the mixture had penetrated too deeply, crystallizing in the extreme cold. The engines roared, tracks grinding against frozen earth. But the tanks were effectively immobilized weapons, threats without function. Mackenzie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He realized that his gamble had not only neutralized German armor but had shifted the entire dynamic of the battlefield. Where before the Tigers had been nearly unstoppable, now they were vulnerable, their crews bewildered and frustrated. Infantry, dependent on armored cover, found themselves exposed. And the Americans, hidden in prepared positions with tank destroyers ready, could now take aim at immobilized steel. The battle raged around him. Artillery shells screamed overhead, plumes of snow and earth erupting from frozen ground. Mortars fired in rhythmic volleys, the cracks echoing across the valley. Mackenzie's squad took casualties, men falling where they stood, the snow turning red in places. But the Tigers' incapacitation created gaps in the German lines, and 3rd Squad exploited them. Machine guns opened up, taking advantage of the immobilized armor to suppress enemy infantry. Mortars targeted clusters of soldiers that had relied on the tank's firepower for cover. Holloway crawled over to Mackenzie, keeping low. "You did this," he said, almost in a whisper. "Your work. That Tiger there, the 4th one, is dead in the water." He nodded toward the tank, turret frozen, commander screaming orders that could not be executed. "It's like someone hit pause on the battlefield." Mackenzie allowed himself a brief exhale. He could see the immediate effects of his work. The Germans were improvising desperately. Crews dismounted from immobilized Tigers, attempting to repair the mechanisms. Soldiers scrambled over the frozen ground, trying to shield their commanders and regain control. But nothing worked. The extreme cold had locked the grease in place, turning the finely tuned machinery of the turret into an immovable mass. By 10:30, the results were undeniable. 4 out of 5 Tigers were effectively neutralized. Unable to rotate their turrets and, in effect, blind to everything outside a narrow frontal arc, American tank destroyers, hidden in prepared positions, took full advantage, hitting 2 Tigers directly from the side. Fire and smoke erupted from their turrets, and the crews abandoned the vehicles in panic. The remaining 2 tanks retreated, abandoning the attack entirely, while their crews attempted to reorganize as infantry. Mackenzie watched it all, tension and adrenaline coursing through him, knowing the danger was far from over. Meanwhile, the Americans were exploiting the frozen landscape, artillery and small arms fire synchronized with the immobilized German armor. Mackenzie's gamble had turned what would have been a near-certain disaster into a defensive opportunity. But the battle demanded vigilance. Any misstep, and the remaining Tiger could wreak havoc. Any oversight, and Third Squad could be wiped out. He stayed crouched in the snow, eyes scanning every movement, calculating angles, tracking enemy soldiers and armored vehicles. As the morning wore on, Lieutenant Morrison arrived on the forward line, surveying the battlefield with a mixture of disbelief and awe. "Sergeant Holloway tells me you had something to do with those Tigers jamming," he said, voice steady but incredulous. "And that you went forward without orders, exposed yourself to enemy fire, implementing some kind of chemistry experiment?" Mackenzie didn't respond immediately. He simply watched as the battlefield unfolded, the snow swirling around burning tanks and retreating soldiers. Holloway spoke for him. "Yes, sir. That's his work. And it saved us." Morrison remained quiet for a moment, processing the gravity of what had happened. Then, he spoke with measured approval. "Corpus Intelligence wants to know more. They're calling your grease mixture a battlefield innovation. They want to replicate it, distribute it to other units. Apparently, some colonel believes this could work on a larger scale." Mackenzie shrugged, indifferent. The accolades mattered less than the fact that Third Squad had survived, that the German advance had stalled, that lives had been spared. He had risked death for a mechanical theory, and it had worked. The frozen grease trick was real, lethal in its simplicity, and utterly effective. August 1943. A typhoon hits a U.S. military base in the Pacific. Wind speeds reach 150 miles per hour. When it's over, every wooden barracks is destroyed. Roofs torn off. Walls collapsed. 300 soldiers without shelter, 6,000 miles from home. But one type of building stands untouched. Not a single panel damaged. A curved steel structure that looked ridiculous. Engineers said it would fail. It didn't. This is how the Quonset hut survived what nothing else could. When America entered World War II, the military needed bases across the Pacific immediately. The standard solution was wooden barracks. Simple, fast to build, familiar. The problem was the Pacific environment destroyed them almost as fast as they went up. The tropical heat and humidity rotted wood in months. Termites consumed support beams from the inside. Buildings that looked solid would suddenly collapse. Maintenance crews couldn't keep up with the decay rate. Then came the typhoons. Pacific storms with sustained winds over 100 miles per hour. Rectangular wooden buildings acted like sails. Wind would catch the broad side, connections would fail, and entire buildings disintegrated. During one typhoon in 1943, a single base lost over 200 buildings in hours. The shipping problem was just as critical. Every piece of lumber had to be shipped thousands of miles across submarine-infested waters. Cargo space was desperately needed for ammunition and fuel. The military needed buildings that required minimal shipping volume, could be assembled in hours by non-experts, and could survive typhoons. The specification seemed impossible. Enter engineer Peter Mellon at Quonset Point Naval Air Station. His solution was radical. instead of fighting wind with a rectangular structure, build a half-cylinder. A simple curved arch of corrugated steel anchored directly to the ground. No separate walls and roof, just one continuous curve. No complex framing, the corrugated steel provided all the structural strength. Military architects hated it. It looked like a drainage pipe. The curved walls meant lost usable space. The all-metal construction would be blazing hot in summer. The design was too simple, surely something so basic couldn't work, but Mellon understood physics the architects missed. The half-cylinder presents minimal surface area to wind from any direction. Wind hitting the curved surface deflects over and around instead of catching and pushing. An arch converts loads into compression forces along the curve, which steel handles perfectly. The corrugations add rigidity preventing buckling. The entire structure acts as one integrated unit with no weak connection points. The shipping efficiency was revolutionary. A complete 20 by 48 foot Quonset, big enough for 15 to 20 men, packed into a space the size of a pickup truck bed. Compare that to the lumber volume for an equivalent wooden barracks. A crew of 8 non-specialists with basic tools could erect a complete Quonset in under 8 hours. No welding, no heavy equipment, no skilled carpentry required. The real test came during typhoon season 1943. Bases now had a mix of wooden barracks and Quonset huts. When typhoons hit, the results were undeniable. At one base in the Philippines, a typhoon with 140 mph sustained winds hit directly. Every wooden building was destroyed or severely damaged. The Quonset huts remained standing. Not just standing, virtually undamaged. A few panels had minor dents where debris struck them. That was it. Troops who'd been housed in Quonsets rode out the storm inside. Troops in wooden barracks had to evacuate to shelters. The physics are straightforward. At 140 mph, wind pressure is roughly 100 pounds per square foot. On a rectangular building with a 40-foot wall, that's 40,000 pounds of force trying to push it over. Wooden connections pull out under that stress. The Quonset's arch shape means wind pressure creates compression forces that push the structure down into its foundation rather than trying to tip it over. The structure gets more stable under wind load, not less. There's a documented case from Okinawa. A Quonset took a direct hit from debris during a typhoon. A large piece of wooden building launched by wind struck at high speed. The debris punched through one corrugated panel. That single panel dented, but the structural integrity was unaffected. After the storm, a crew replaced that panel in 20 minutes. The building was immediately back in service. Compare that to wooden barracks with even minor damage. If wind tore off part of the roof, water would pour in. The building would be uninhabitable until major repairs were completed, taking days or weeks. A Quonset could take significant damage and remain functional. By 1943, the Quonset had proven itself so thoroughly that the military scaled up production massively. Between 1941 and 1946, over 170,000 Quonset huts were manufactured. They shipped to every theater, Pacific Islands, North Africa, Europe, Alaska. They served as housing, hospitals, mess halls, workshops, warehouses, and aircraft hangars. The cost efficiency was remarkable. A wooden barracks cost $1,800 in 1943 and required constant maintenance. A Quonset cost $1,300, required virtually no maintenance. Lasted far longer, and could be disassembled and reused. Over its service life, a Quonset cost perhaps a quarter of traditional construction. When the war ended, the military sold tens of thousands as surplus. Veterans who'd lived in them during the war bought them for homes, workshops, and farm buildings. A veteran could buy a surplus Quonset for a few $100s and erect it on his property in a weekend. The post-war housing shortage made the timing perfect. Here's what's remarkable: Quonset-style buildings are still being manufactured today, 80 years later. Modern versions use improved materials, but the curved arch shape persists because the physics that made it work in 1941 are still valid. They're used for homes, warehouses, workshops, farm buildings. The prepper community loves them. The tiny house movement has embraced them. The military architects who criticized the design for being too simple missed the entire point. The simplicity wasn't a flaw, it was the genius. Fewer components means fewer failure points. Simpler assembly means less room for error. Basic geometry means the physics work reliably regardless of conditions. The Quonset hut saved countless lives during World War II by providing shelter that didn't fail when everything else did. Troops who slept safely through Pacific typhoons while wooden buildings disintegrated around them understood the value. And that value continues today. Sometimes the best solution really is the simplest one. Sometimes the design that looks wrong turns out to be exactly right. And sometimes an engineer with 60 days and an impossible problem creates something that lasts forever. On October 9, 1942, 20,000 feet above a jungle island called Guadalcanal, a 22-year-old Aeacan islet named Mayan Cal was fighting for his life. He was flying a Guan F-4F Wildcat, a stubby, K-based fight, and he was being hunted. His Ine was a Mitsubishi A6M0, a lane so light, so agile, it felt like it was for the future. It could ton inside the Wildcat's 80s twice Onui. It could clib like a rocket. For the Astye, the Zio had been a ghost, a Hanto that owned the skies fo peel habo to the Philippines. Mayan Cal was an ace, but now he was just eat. The Zio was on his tail. He ushed his Wildcat into a die. The Aeacan lane gained seed, but the Zio stayed with high. He ald had, ite. The Wildcat isonded, but slowly, like the P-38, it felt ushy. The Zio was already the, anticiating his Onui, its cannons winking. Cal's cocket exploded. Channel toe thuff his leg. His controls went dead. He was going down. He managed to bail out, landing in the shake-infested weights, sad only by a iacle. This was the reality of the AIY in the Pacific. This was Guadalcanal. But just weeks late, another fa boy fo South Dakota would clib into the say sky and change everything. It wasn't a wa. It was a eat jinda. A lace we Aeacan islets we being fed one by one into the teeth of the Janese wa sheen. The Aeacan s called the islets the cactus ai fos. The islets Thesiles called the base Henderson field the Gayad. The obel wasn't just the Zio. It was the Doctine. The exets back in Aeaca, the engineers had a sile solution. Ni ton with a Zio. It was the say Doctine as the P-38 islets. Use your seed, use your AO, die, shoot, and un. But in the chaotic, swirling dog fights Onui Guadalcanal, that Doctine was getting killed single day. The Janese islets we Edians. They had fought Onui China, Onui Peel Habo. They knew they acafed, they baited the Aeacans into tons. They knew the Wildcat was slow to ascend. They knew exactly we to shoot. The Aeacans we losing deceitly. What the Cactus AI foes didn't know, what the Edian Janese islets couldn't possibly know was that the solution was on its way. But it wasn't a new lane. It wasn't a new Doctine fo Washington. It was a 27-year-old Fay. And so unassuming he had been told he was too old to fly in combat, and who had leaned to shoot not fo a ilite annual but by hunting Jack Abbots on the frozen lanes of South Dakota. This is the story of Joe's J. Foss and the sile forgotten Fay's tick that aid high Aeaca's ace of aces. To understand how a single Fay could teoize the Janese AI fos, you fist hay to understand the fa. Joe Foss was not a key soldi. He was born in 1915 on a Eot unelectrified Fawnee Sioux Falls, South Dakota. His childhood wasn't sent in classes. It was sent in the dit, in the cold, and in the wind. This was the Dade Isis Goliath story, just like Sio he. But Foss's Goliath wasn't just the Ine. It was life itself. The Geet Dieschen hit South Dakota like an Atali Bage. The land died Euro. The coes failed. The Faily had nothing. Foss's tsisu, that finished git, was built for necessity. He and his faith would hunt to at food on the table. And this is we the ceaset audification begins. When a 12-year-old Joe Foss hunted Jack Abbott's, he didn't hay a sco. He had an old shotgun. And one you'll fo his faith. Don't waste shells. A Jack Abbott doesn't in a state line. It wheeze. It dats. It eases. To hit it, you couldn't AI at it. You had to AI we it was going to be. It's called deflection shooting. While oth kids we leaning ath, Foss was calculating lead, windage, and seed in his head in a fraction of a second. He wasn't just a good shot. He was a idato. He understood the science of hitting a owing target. This was his iron sight. This was his ENOY. It was a FASI that Ilite annuals couldn't teach. But Foss didn't want to hunt Abbots. He wanted to fly. In 1933, his faith took high to an AI show. He saw a Maine Coast squadron flying bylanes. He was 18 and he was hooked. He told his faith, "That's what I going to do." The ath was iosable, he was a Ro-O-Fa kid. He had no education. When his faith was tragically killed by a downed O-line, Joe at 19 had to do out of school to on the Fa. He was taid, but he had that tsisu. He woked the Fa by day and took night classes. It took high 6 years to get enough sedits to ent college. He woked his way thuff washing dishes to get a ILA test license. When Peel Habo was attacked, Joe Foss was 26 years old, he aced to enlist in the Navy to be a pilot. He was ejected. He was too old. In 1941, the Kyoto off-age for a fight pilot was 25. They told High he could be a flight instructor. Teach oth kids how to fly. It was a devastating blow. It was the engineering office telling McKenna the cables we within sec. It was the exets telling Sio Haiha to use a SCO. The doctine said he was unfit for combat, so Foss did what McKenna did. He broke the yules. He found a loophole. He joined the main Co's Rec. He beaky an instructo. And fo 9 long aunts, he watched as 20-year-old kids he had tamed we sent off to Wa. Foss was enaged. He hounded his swayos. He deanded combat. He wote lets. He aid noise. He was, in his own wads, the loudest, ost annoying instructo in the nay. Finally, just to shut High Euro, they gay in, they sent High to a danced fight training. He was assigned to a new squadron, VMF 121. And in October 1942, as Mayan Cal was being shot out of the sky, 27-year-old Ganda Joe Foss, the too old Fay Fo South Dakota, was on a Tansit She. His destination, Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The lace he ate at was not a Ilite base. It was hell. The oant he steed off the lane, the cell hit high. A thick hued ikes of engine oil, odding jungle, and death, the unway was a arcaked sty of dit and gale cade out of the Altes. The oeation scent was a wooden shack nade the pagoda. The Ilates quates we ud flood tents, and iwi we the wex. Dozens of F4F Wildcats, P-39s, should to the side of the unway, they wings ton off, they engines shatteed, they cocket stained. This was the gayad of the Cactus AI Fos. Foss was assigned to his tent. He at the end he would be flying with, they weenty the fesh-faced kids he had tamed. They we ghosts. They faces we yellow with Atabane, the anti-Alea dug. They eyes we bloodshot fo lack of slee. They flight suits we stained with sweat and geese. They we Edians, but they we also hunted. Foss, the olden, the Fay, walked in. They looked at High. He was new eat. He was another body to alace the one they lost yesterday. Foss looked at his assigned lane, a Guan F4F Wildcat, it was the say lane Mayan Cal was shot down in. It was hay. It was slow. It was, by all accounts, a flying coffin against the Zio. The squadron's executive office, a Nade Duke, gave Foss the standard beefing, the one that was getting the all killed. Ni ton with a Zio. Ni. Joe Foss listened. He nodded. He understood the wads, but he also understood something the doctrine had ist. He understood jack rabbits. The next morning, Foss would fly his fist ishin, he was heading straight into the kill zone. He was a fay in a flying coffin, about to fight the Osta danced fight lane on ETH. And he was about to use a tick that wasn't in any annual. Joe Foss's fist flight Onui Guadalcanal was not attaining on. It was a tile by Phi. He climbed to 15,000 feet, his eyes scanning the eddy blue. The ghosts in his squadron had waned high. They go out of the sun, you need see thee until they is shooting at you. Foss was leading his fist atoll and he felt blind. Then the adio cackled. Bandits 11 o'clock high. Foss looked Euro. He saw the affiliation of Mitsubishi Zios dying. They were fast than anything he had seen. He beat his odes. Ni ton. Die and un. Foss should his stick forward, at his wildcat into a seeing die. His hay lane exiliated. The Zios followed. One of the een Phi, Taces Zide asked Fox Canoy, close enough to ache high flinch. He kept dying all the way to the jungle Canoy, shaking the Zios off his tail. He attuned to Henderson Field, his hands shaking, not faux fee, but faux ange. The doctrine was wrong. He knew it. You couldn't win by running away. You could only sui. And Joe Foss hadn't he to sui. He had he to hunt. On October 13th, just days after Zale, Foss was leading another atoll, this tie they into a goo of Jenny's bobs protected by Zios. The dog fight began. It was chaos. Wildots and Zios twisting in the sky. Foss saw a Zio lock onto his Winganess tail. The Jenny's eyelet was closing in for the kill. The doctrine said Foss should die away. Find an easy target. The Fayes I said something defiant. Foss all his wild cat had. He wasn't aiming at the Zio. He was aiming where the Jack Abbott was going to be, he old the Tig. His 650 cali machine guns owed to life. He fired a long 3-second bust, not at the Ine lane, but at a atch of eddy blue sky 200 feet in front of it. It looked like a mistake, a wasted shot, but the Jenny's eyelet focused on his own kill, didn't see Foss. He executed a effect tight ton and flew directly into the stee of 50 kli bounds. The Zos wing silly K off. The lane vanished in a cloud of Edel and Phi. I thought living in an HOA neighborhood would be peaceful, until they sent me a notice for a minor rule violation. It said, trash cans aren't allowed here, $50 fine per day. At first, I was mad. Then I got creative. The next day, I built a bat house right next to the trash cans. Why? Because bats are a protected species, and now the HOA can't touch it. When they told me to remove it, I just smiled and said, as long as the bats are here, I'm following the rules. Sometimes, the pettiest revenge is the most satisfying. Ryan was a billionaire, confident, sharp, and used to getting whatever he wanted. He lived in a world of luxury, where money spoke louder than emotions. And beside him sat Lena, his girlfriend, simple, kind, and from a humble background. One evening, Ryan took Lena to an expensive restaurant filled with the city's elite. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above, and everyone wore designer clothes. Lena smiled nervously, feeling out of place but happy just to be with him, but Ryan wasn't proud of her that night. He looked around, then leaned forward and whispered coldly, "Lena. You don't really fit in here. People will talk. You're not one of us." Her smile faded. "One of us?" she asked quietly. "You mean rich?" Ryan shrugged. "I'm just saying, maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere simpler. This place isn't for people like you." The words cut deeper than he could imagine. Lena stood up, her eyes filled with tears. "Maybe you're right," she said softly. "Maybe I don't belong here, or with you." And she walked out. A week later, Ryan attended a major business conference, surrounded by investors and CEOs. The host's voice echoed, "Please welcome our keynote speaker, the CEO of Starrise Investments, Miss Lena Roberts." Ryan froze. Lena walked onto the stage in a sleek black suit, confident and composed. The same woman he had once called not good enough. She smiled at the audience and began. "True success isn't about wealth. It's about respect, something no amount of money can buy." As the crowd applauded, Ryan could only stare. In that moment, he realized what he had truly lost, not a poor girl, but a woman richer in heart and strength than he could ever be. Moral: never judge someone by their status. The person you look down on today may be the one you look up to tomorrow.
Hello little friends. It's time to settle down for some peaceful bedtime stories. Get cozy under your blankets, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's drift into dreamland together. Tonight, we have 5 gentle stories to help you relax and fall asleep. Sweet dreams. Once upon a time, high up in the evening sky, there lived a little cloud named Fluffy. Fluffy was the softest, gentlest cloud in the whole sky. Every evening, as the sun would set, Fluffy would float slowly, very slowly, across the purple and pink sky. Fluffy loved to drift over houses and peek through windows, watching the children below getting ready for bed. "Sleep well, little ones," Fluffy would whisper softly, in a voice as gentle as the breeze. One peaceful evening, Fluffy floated over a small house with a yellow light glowing in the window. Inside, a little girl named Emma was lying in bed, but her eyes were still wide open. "Oh dear," thought Fluffy. "This little one needs help falling asleep." So Fluffy floated lower and lower, until Fluffy was right outside Emma's window. And then, Fluffy began to make the gentlest, softest rain. Pit, pat, pit, pat, pit, pat, on the window. Emma listened to the peaceful sound. Pit, pat, pit, pat. It was like nature's lullaby. The soft drops tapped gently against the glass. Emma's eyes began to feel heavy. Her breathing became slow and deep. She yawned, a big, comfortable yawn. As the gentle rain continued. Pit, pat, Emma's eyelids slowly closed. And soon, she was fast asleep, dreaming of floating through the soft evening sky, holding hands with her friend Fluffy, drifting on gentle breezes, among the stars. Fluffy smiled, a soft, cloudy smile, and floated away peacefully, to help more children fall asleep.
June 1944, Allied bombers approached the French coast carrying the largest conventional bombs ever built. Each tallboy weighs 12,000 pounds, 5 tons of high explosive designed to penetrate deep underground and destroy anything. The target, German U-boat pens at St. Nazaire. Massive concrete structures protecting the submarines that are strangling Allied supply lines across the Atlantic, the bombers release direct hits. The explosions are visible from 20 miles away. Dust and smoke blanket the entire harbor. When reconnaissance aircraft photograph the damage the next day, they can't believe what they see. The U-boat pens are still standing. Not damaged, standing. The concrete roofs absorbed direct hits from weapons designed to destroy anything and barely cracked. How did German engineers build structures that could survive direct hits from the most powerful conventional weapons in existence? This isn't just a story about concrete. This is about engineering taken to an extreme that seemed impossible. And it worked. To understand why these structures exist, you need to understand what was at stake. In 1942 and 1943, German U-boats were sinking Allied ships faster than they could be replaced. Over 3,500 Allied merchant vessels were sent to the bottom. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest continuous military campaign of World War II, and Germany was winning. U-boats operated from bases along the French Atlantic coast after Germany conquered France. The submarines would leave port, hunt in the Atlantic shipping lanes, and return to refit, rearm, and prepare for the next patrol. The problem for Germany was that these bases were vulnerable to Allied bombing. A submarine tied up at a dock was an easy target. Bomb the docks, destroy the submarines, and you win the Atlantic campaign. The Germans tried various protection methods. They built anti-aircraft gun emplacements around the bases. They stationed fighter aircraft to intercept bombers. They used smoke generators to obscure the harbors during raids. None of it worked well enough. Allied bombers flying at night could still get through and damage submarines under repair, so German engineers proposed something radical. Instead of protecting the submarines with guns and fighters that might stop some attacks, build structures so strong that bombs simply couldn't penetrate them. Create fortified submarine pens with concrete roofs thick enough to absorb direct hits from the heaviest bombs in the Allied arsenal. The proposal seemed insane from an engineering and logistics standpoint. The amount of concrete required would be enormous. The construction would take massive labor and resources. The structures would be among the largest military constructions ever attempted. But the alternative was losing the Battle of the Atlantic and potentially losing the war. Construction began in 1941. The basic design was brutally simple. Excavate massive rectangular bays large enough to hold U-boats. Build walls of heavily reinforced concrete. Pour a roof slab so thick that bombs couldn't penetrate it. Simple in concept. Insane in execution. The roof thickness at St. Nazaire, one of the largest U-boat pen complexes, was over 23 feet of reinforced concrete. Not 23 inches to 23 feet. That's roughly 7 meters of concrete and steel rebar in multiple layers. Each square meter of roof contained tons of material. The total concrete volume for the entire complex exceeded 480,000 cubic meters, enough to build a solid concrete cube 78 meters on each side, but thickness alone wouldn't work. Concrete under extreme impact tends to crack and spall. The Germans designed a layered structure. The bottom layer of the roof was thick reinforced concrete designed to provide the primary structural support. Above that, a layer of granite aggregate concrete specifically formulated for impact resistance. Then a thick air gap empty space to allow blast pressure to dissipate. Then another layer of reinforced concrete. The roof was essentially a multi-layer shield with built-in shock absorption. The walls were almost as impressive as the roof. Over 12 feet thick at the base, they were designed not just to support the roof but to resist lateral blast forces if a bomb exploded near the structure. The Germans poured the walls in continuous sections to minimize joints and weak points. The concrete mix used special aggregates and high cement content to maximize compressive strength. The internal structure was compartmentalized. Each submarine pen was a separate bay with dividing walls between them. This meant damage to one bay wouldn't affect others. A single bomb penetrating the roof, unlikely but possible, would destroy one submarine at most, not the entire facility. the construction logistics were staggering. Concrete was mixed on-site in massive batches and poured continuously to prevent joints from forming. The steel reinforcement was assembled in prefabricated sections and lifted into place with cranes. Labor came from multiple sources: German construction workers, French contractors, and forced labor from occupied territories. At peak construction, thousands of workers operated in shifts 24 hours a day. The speed was remarkable considering the scale. The Saint-Nazaire complex began construction in February 1941. The first submarine pens were operational by mid-1942, under 18 months from start to first use. By 1943, the complex included 14 submarine pens, each capable of holding a Type 7 U-boat, plus dry docks for major repairs, workshops, stores, and accommodation for crews. The Allies recognized the threat immediately. U-boats operating from protected bases meant they could conduct more patrols, return for faster refits, and maintain higher operational rates. The campaign to destroy the U-boat pens became a strategic priority. Between 1942 and 1944, Allied bombers conducted dozens of major raids specifically targeting these structures. The early raids used conventional bombs, 1,000 and 2,000 pounders. These barely scratched the concrete. Bomb craters would appear in the ground around the pens. The surrounding harbor facilities would be destroyed. The U-boat pens themselves remained functional. Reconnaissance photos showed minor surface damage to the roofs but no penetration. The Allies escalated. They developed the 4,000-pound cookie bomb designed for maximum blast effect. Raids with these weapons destroyed everything above ground near the pens: workshops, cranes, storage facilities, administrative buildings. The U-boat pens stood. The submarines inside remained protected. In 1944, the Allies deployed their ultimate weapon, the Tallboy. Designed by engineer Barnes Wallis, the Tallboy was a 12,000-pound deep penetration bomb. It was dropped from high altitude, around 20,000 feet, to build up tremendous kinetic energy. The bomb would reach supersonic speeds before impact. The design included a hardened steel casing and a streamlined shape to maximize penetration. The physics of the Tallboy were terrifying. At impact, the bomb carried kinetic energy equivalent to hitting the target with a locomotive traveling at high speed. It would penetrate deep into the ground or structure before the delayed fuse detonated the explosive charge. The explosion would occur underground or inside the structure, destroying it from within. Tallboys had successfully destroyed railway viaducts, underground factories, and hardened German bunkers that conventional bombs couldn't touch. The first Tallboy raid on the Saint-Nazaire U-boat pens occurred in June 1944. Multiple direct hits were recorded. The Tallboys penetrated the outer layer of the roof. Some broke through the air gap and reached the second layer. The explosions were massive. Seismographs detected the impacts from miles away. When the smoke cleared and reconnaissance aircraft photographed the results, the Germans were still operating submarines from the complex. The roof had cracked in places. One bay had partial collapse. But the overall structure remained functional. The British tried again. More Tallboy raids throughout 1944. The largest bomb load ever dropped on a single target up to that point. The U-boat pens accumulated damage. Large sections of the roof developed cracks. Some bays were no longer usable. But the Germans continued operating from the undamaged sections. Not a single submarine inside the pens during any raid was destroyed by bombing. They were protected by 23 feet of engineered concrete that did exactly what it was designed to do. Post-war analysis by Allied engineers revealed why the U-boat pens survived what nothing else could. First, the sheer mass. The weight of the concrete roof created enormous inertia. Even a Tallboy impact, carrying tremendous energy, couldn't transfer enough force to the entire structure to cause catastrophic failure. The bomb would penetrate and create local damage. But the surrounding concrete absorbed the blast energy. Second, the layered design. The air gap between concrete layers was genius. When a bomb penetrated the top layer and detonated, the blast pressure expanded into the air gap. This dissipated energy that would otherwise transfer directly to the lower layers. The air gap acted as a shock absorber, something the Allies hadn't anticipated in their bomb designs. The irony is that the U-boat pens became militarily irrelevant not because of bombing but because the Allies won the Battle of the Atlantic through other means: better anti-submarine warfare tactics, escort carriers, long-range patrol aircraft, breaking German codes, and improved convoy systems. By late 1943, U-boat losses exceeded their ability to sink Allied shipping. The pens protected submarines that were increasingly ineffective in combat. Here's the remarkable part. Most of these U-boat pens still stand today, 80 years later. The structures were too massive to demolish economically. French authorities tried explosive demolition on some sections after the war. The concrete absorbed the charges and remained largely intact. The cost to completely remove these structures would be astronomical. Today they serve various purposes. Some are museums and tourist attractions. Some house cultural centers and art galleries. Some are used for commercial storage. The Saint Nazaire complex is partly preserved as a historical site, partly used for marine industry. The massive submarine bays that once protected U-boats now protect boats of a different kind. The engineering that went into these structures influenced post-war military architecture. Hardened aircraft shelters, missile silos, and command bunkers all use principles learned from the U-boat pen designs: layered construction, air gaps for blast dissipation, massive reinforcement, and compartmentalization. The U-boat pens proved that with enough concrete, steel, and engineering knowledge, you can build structures that survive almost anything. The cost was enormous. The labor was exploitative. The purpose was supporting a war of aggression. But the engineering itself was extraordinary. German engineers created structures designed to survive the ultimate weapons of their time, and those structures did exactly that. Not because they were lucky. Not because the Allies didn't try hard enough. But because the math and physics were correct, the materials were adequate, and the construction was executed properly. 80 years later, those structures remain. Monuments not to war, but to what engineering can achieve when pushed to extremes. The U-boat pens that survived 12,000-pound bombs are still standing, outlasting the war, outlasting the weapons designed to destroy them, outlasting the submarines they were built to protect. Sometimes engineering done right lasts forever, even when its original purpose becomes history.
April 1945, Bavaria, Germany. The spring air carried a brittle chill, lingering over a countryside scarred by months of relentless bombing, scorched earth, and the desolation of retreating armies. Sergeant James Harper's unit had been advancing cautiously through fields littered with remnants of war, abandoned tractors, shattered fences, and homes reduced to splintered husks. Every hill, every grove, and every hollow in the land held the potential for danger, but it also held the possibility of discovery, and in this fragile tension between fear and hope, the unit spotted something remarkable: a massive barn, standing defiantly atop an abandoned farm. Smoke rose lazily from makeshift chimneys. Curling in thin, twisting columns toward the clouded sky, could be enemy holdouts, Private Rodriguez muttered, adjusting his grip on his rifle, eyes scanning the edges of the property with a mixture of suspicion and unease. The barn, its weathered timbers stretching toward the sky, seemed both ancient and imposing. Its stone foundation had survived countless storms and battles, its beams groaning under the weight of decades. It was the kind of structure that might have once been a home, a place of life and work, now scarred by neglect and the chaos of war. Germans hiding, or civilians, James said carefully, his eyes narrowing as he studied the scene. The war was ending. Everyone knew it. Yet that knowledge brought no comfort. Desperation, as he had learned over countless engagements, could make soldiers unpredictable, and civilians could harbor fear so intense it drove them to dangerous extremes. As the unit advanced cautiously, weapons ready, every sense was alert. The air smelled faintly of smoke and damp earth, the ground underfoot uneven, soft in places from recent rains. Each step brought a creak from the old barn doors, a shiver through the frame, a reminder that the building itself was fragile, yet sturdy enough to hold whatever, or whoever, lay within. Then came a sound that froze James in place, silencing even the rustle of his men's movements. Children crying. The plaintive, terrified wail echoed faintly from inside the barn, slicing through the tension with a sudden, human clarity. "Hold fire! He ordered sharply, his voice cutting through the whispers and soft murmurs of the unit. The soldiers froze, rifles steady, adrenaline sharpening their reflexes even as confusion clouded their minds. Rodriguez's brow furrowed. "Those are kids. Could be a trap, though," he whispered. His voice held the edge of fear and disbelief. James's jaw tightened. He had seen booby traps, ambushes, and desperation used as weapons of war, but this was different. The sound of children crying could not be ignored. The weight of choice pressed down on him. Step forward, investigate, risk potential exposure, or step back, leave them, and live with the consequences of inaction. James moved to the barn's massive door, hand steady on the latch despite his racing heartbeat. With a deep breath, he pushed it open. The interior was a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The barn was packed, hundreds of small, trembling bodies huddled together for warmth. Toddlers clutched ragged blankets, older children embraced the younger ones, some curled in silence, others rocking gently or murmuring softly to themselves. Filth and grime coated their clothing and skin. Evidence of long weeks without adequate food, water, or hygiene. Corporal Miller's whisper cut through the quiet gloom. "Dear God! What is this?" An older girl, perhaps 15, stepped forward from the cluster, her face pale, eyes wide with fear and hope mingled. She spoke rapidly in German, voice quivering as if the words themselves were a lifeline to some fragile hope. James motioned to Private Clean, the unit's translator. He knelt, listening intently. After a moment, he straightened, voice shaking as he relayed the girl's message. "They're orphans," Clean said, almost unable to believe it himself. "From all over Germany. Parents killed in bombings, fighting camps. They were in an orphanage in Munich. When the city was bombed, the staff fled. These children walked 40 miles. Looking for shelter." James's heart sank. "How long have they been here?" he asked. Clean translated quickly, voice catching. 2 weeks. No food left. 3 children died yesterday from cold and hunger." The enormity of the revelation pressed on him with staggering weight. German children, technically enemy civilians, dying in a barn while armed American soldiers stood outside, fully capable of offering aid. What were they supposed to do? The choice was clear in its moral gravity, yet fraught with potential consequences. This was no longer a military engagement, it was a test of humanity itself. Sergeant Miller's voice broke through the tension. "What do we do?" James looked around at the huddled children, their hollow eyes reflecting both fear and hope. Their nationality, once a matter of military concern, now seemed irrelevant. They were children, human beings, innocent in a world that had demanded so much from them far too soon. "We help them," he said, voice firm, steady, leaving no room for doubt. Miller hesitated. "Sir. Regulations." James's expression hardened. "I don't care about regulations. These are children. We're soldiers, not monsters. Command might have our heads for this. Then they'll have mine. But I'm not leaving kids to die because bureaucrats wrote rules that don't account for basic human decency." He turned to his unit, issuing orders with the precision of a man accustomed to life and death decisions. "Rodriguez, Miller, scout the farm for supplies. Clean, talk to that girl, find out what they need most urgently. Daniels, radio command. Tell them we found civilians requiring humanitarian assistance. Don't sugarcoat it. Let them know they're children. Let command deal with the politics." The unit moved into action. Years of rigorous military training now redirected toward saving lives instead of taking them. Rodriguez and Miller explored the property and found a root cellar with preserved vegetables, a well with clean water, firewood stacked neatly in a shed. The nearby farmhouse, abandoned but structurally sound, could shelter the younger children, providing protection from wind and weather far better than the barn could offer. James took a moment to survey the scene, noting the transformation of his men. Battle-hardened soldiers, accustomed to strategy and firepower, were now caregivers, planners, providers. This isn't what war was supposed to look like, James thought, staring at the huddled children. But maybe this is what ending war looks like. He ordered the first priority: feed them. Small portions, warm water, carefully rationed. Their stomachs had been empty too long, any sudden intake could be dangerous. Medical needs would follow, triaged according to urgency. Anna, the older girl, stepped forward again, speaking slowly in carefully learned English. Why? Why help us? Her eyes, large and wary, searched James's face. Your children, he said simply. That's all that matters. Your commanders might be angry, but right now, you need food, warmth, and safety. That's what you're getting. Tears ran down Anna's face as she whispered. Thank you. We thought we would die here. The soldiers set to work. Water was heated, food carefully distributed. Slowly, the fear in the children's faces began to give way to cautious hope. Some smiled, some cried, some simply stared, trying to process the sudden intrusion of safety and kindness into a life defined by loss. Clean whispered to James, voice low. Command won't like this. Higher-ups, regulations. This isn't what we were sent to do. James shook his head, resolute. Then let them. I won't abandon these kids. Not for regulations. Not for politics. Not for fear of repercussions. A crackle from Daniel's radio interrupted the moment, and James felt a cold knot of apprehension. The captain's voice came through, sharp, incredulous. Harper, what the hell is this? You're supposed to secure the area, not run a charity. Sir, James said, calm but firm, there are 200 children here. Starving. Sick. Some as young as 3. I cannot leave them. Enemy civilians, Sergeant. Not our responsibility. They're children, Captain. Human beings. That makes them everyone's responsibility. A long silence followed, the crackle of the radio filling the room with tension. Then, finally, fine. Hold position. Medical units and supplies are on the way. But this better not blow up in my face. April 1945, Bavaria. The war in Europe was in its final stages, yet danger still lingered around every corner. Sergeant James Harper's unit of American soldiers had been moving cautiously through the rolling countryside, the remnants of German towns scarred by bombs and artillery fire. The countryside seemed eerily quiet, almost like it was holding its breath. Smoke rising from a distant structure caught the edge of James' vision, and he signaled for the men to halt. Through the binoculars, a massive old barn came into view on what had once been a thriving farmstead. Smoke drifted lazily from crude chimneys made of scrap metal. Harper's instincts flared. Could be enemy holdouts, Private Rodriguez murmured, raising his rifle instinctively. James didn't dismiss the possibility, but he weighed it carefully. Could be soldiers, could be civilians, he replied. His voice was calm, measured, though his heart raced. The war was winding down, but that didn't mean the danger had disappeared. Desperate men did desperate things, and even in the final weeks of fighting, civilians had learned to hide or exploit American troops' mercy. The unit approached the barn slowly, their rifles ready, senses on high alert. The barn was old, ancient, really. Thick timber beams and stone walls had withstood decades of weather and somehow survived bombings that had flattened surrounding villages. As they drew closer, James froze mid-step. From within the structure came a sound that cut through the tense silence like a knife. Children crying. Hold fire, he barked, lowering his weapon. Kids? Rodriguez asked, disbelief in his voice. German kids. Could be a trap. James hesitated, then motioned forward. Could be exactly what it sounds like. But we'll find out. Carefully. The heavy wooden doors of the barn groaned as James pushed them open. Inside, the sight was almost too much to bear. The space was packed with children. Their small bodies huddled together for warmth. Ages ranged from toddlers barely able to walk to teenagers, all emaciated, filthy, and terrified. Harper felt his throat tighten. "Dear God," Corporal Miller whispered behind him. An older girl, perhaps 15, stepped forward, speaking rapid German. Private Clean, the unit's translator, leaned in. "She says they're orphans," Clean said, voice trembling. "From Munich. Parents killed in bombings or during the fighting. When the orphanage was bombed, the staff fled. The children walked here, 40 miles, searching for shelter." "How long have they been here?" James asked, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. 2 weeks. No food left. 3 children died yesterday from hunger and cold. The contradiction was unbearable. German children, technically enemy civilians, were dying while armed American soldiers stood mere meters away. Rules and military regulations felt meaningless against the immediate reality of suffering before them. James' mind raced, balancing logic, protocol, and what his conscience demanded. "What do we do?" Miller asked, finally breaking the stunned silence. James looked around at the barnful of hollow-eyed children. Their nationality, their supposed enemy status, suddenly didn't matter. "We help them," he said firmly, "sir." "Regulations," Miller began. "I don't care about regulations. These are children. We're soldiers, not monsters. We help them. Command can worry about paperwork later. But these kids? Not on my watch." The decision made, Harper directed his team into action. Rodriguez and Miller scouted the farmstead for supplies. Clean spoke with the girl, learning what was needed most urgently. Daniels radioed command, reporting that civilians required immediate humanitarian assistance. Within the next hour, the unit discovered a root cellar stocked with preserved vegetables, a clean well, and a shed with firewood. The farmhouse, though abandoned, was intact and could shelter the younger children. For the first time in weeks, the children had hope. Soldiers who had spent years trained for combat were now performing acts of care, feeding, warming, and comforting enemy children. Harper watched them, struck by the strange reversal of war's purpose. "Get them fed first," James ordered. "Small portions. Their stomachs won't handle much after starving." Anna, the older girl, stepped forward. She spoke careful English, learned before the war had destroyed her life. "Why are you helping us? We are German. We are enemy." "Your nationality doesn't matter," James said gently. "Your children. That's all that matters. Command may be angry, but right now, you need warmth, food, and safety. You'll get them." Tears welled in Anna's eyes. "Thank you. We thought we would die here." Over the next several hours, the unit distributed food and water. Slowly, despair on the children's faces gave way to cautious trust. Some smiled, some cried, but all were grateful. Harper and his men worked tirelessly, setting up the barn and farmhouse into makeshift living quarters, establishing a basic routine that could sustain the children. "This is going to cause problems," Clean whispered. "Command won't like this. We're supposed to be liberating towns, not running orphanages." "Then they can court-martial me," James said, surveying the barn. "But I'm not abandoning these kids." Soon, the radio crackled. Captain Morrison's voice sounded tight with irritation. "Sergeant, command wants to know what's going on. This better not be some civilian aid stunt." Harper answered, calm but resolute. "Captain, there are 200 children here. Starving, freezing, dying. I can't leave them. They're enemy civilians, Sergeant. Not our responsibility. They're children, sir. Human beings. That makes them everyone's responsibility." A long pause. Finally, damn it, Harper. Fine. Hold position. We'll send a medical unit and supplies. But this had better not blow up in my face. Relief mingled with exhaustion as James hung up the radio. His unit looked at him with new respect. You just gambled your career for German kids, Rodriguez said quietly. Worth it, Harper replied simply. As night fell over the Bavarian farm, 200 children slept warm and fed for the first time in weeks. The soldiers had transformed the abandoned buildings into a sanctuary. Medical personnel arrived within days, treating malnutrition, infections, and illnesses. 2 children succumbed to pneumonia and starvation despite their efforts. But the remainder survived because Harper and his men had chosen humanity over orders. The barn, once a symbol of desolation, now pulsed with life. The farmhouse became a hospital for the sickest children, while the older ones helped care for the younger. Anna acted as liaison, translating and organizing, filling in the gaps that war had left in communication and structure. She shared the story of the orphanage in Munich, bombed 3 times, staff abandoned them, children forced to flee alone, and how they ended up at the Harper farm by sheer luck, or perhaps fate. The director died in the 3rd raid, Anna whispered. The staff. They just left us. Told us to find family, find shelter. We had nothing. You did good, James said softly. You got them here. We're just finishing what you started. The unit worked tirelessly over the following days. Supplies arrived, more soldiers volunteered, and even skeptical commanders began to recognize the enormity of what Harper had undertaken. Colonel Bradford himself arrived to inspect the situation. His presence, austere and commanding, seemed poised to turn the entire operation into a tribunal. Harper led the colonel through the farm. The barn was organized, the farmhouse functioning as a hospital. Children ate breakfast, some smiled, some played, some clung to the soldiers with hesitant trust. Bradford observed quietly, his face unreadable. A little girl approached him shyly, offering a flower. The gesture, simple yet profound, seemed to pierce the rigid officer's demeanor. You've commandeered military resources, Bradford said eventually, voice cold. Diverted your unit from combat operations. Violated fraternization policies. I should court-martial you. Yes, sir, Harper replied. But these children would be dead without our intervention. Bradford's expression softened. Then continue. Military humanitarian mission. Full support. Make sure the world knows what real victory looks like. The unit had succeeded. Their gamble on compassion over protocol had not only saved lives but created a blueprint for humanitarian action in the war's dying days. And as night fell once more, the children of the Bavarian barn slept safe and warm, their cries replaced by the quiet hum of survival and hope. The journey across Europe began under the shadow of uncertainty, yet fueled by the fragile hope Harper and his unit had ignited in the children. Trucks rumbled over snow-patched roads, carrying the weary survivors from Bavaria toward the coast.
May 6, 1944, Atlantic Ocean, 20 miles west of the Cape Verde Islands. The sea was glass calm, the moon full, the stars cold and merciless. Beneath them, the USS Buckley. DE-51 cut a white V through the still water, her twin screws churning the dark Atlantic into silver foam. On her bridge stood Lieutenant Commander Brent Abel, 34 years old, lean, sunburned, and running on black coffee and nerves. He had commanded Buckley barely a year, yet tonight he was about to fight the strangest battle in the history of modern naval warfare. At 0216 hours, the radio crackled. The nasal voice of a Grumman TBF Avenger pilot filled the bridge. Contact sighted, surface sub bearing 160 degrees 20 miles ahead, west of Cape Verde. She's on batteries, charging low speed. Abel's grey eyes narrowed. Plot it, he ordered. Sound general quarters. Klaxons wailed through the ship. Men tumbled from bunks, boots half-laced, helmets pulled over bare heads. Buckley's decks hummed as the gun crews ran to their 3-inch mounts, 40mm Bofors, and 20mm Oerlikons. The pilot's sighting could mean only one thing: a German Type 9, C/40 U-boat, and not just any boat. Intelligence had reported U-66, commanded by Korvettenkapitän Gerhard Seehausen, operating near these waters. U-66 was a killer, credited with 33 Allied ships sunk, over 200,000 tons lost to the deep. She had terrorized convoys from the Caribbean to Freetown. If that was the boat ahead, Buckley was about to meet one of the deadliest predators in the Atlantic. "Flank speed," Abel said. "All ahead, 23.5 knots. The destroyer escort surged forward, bow cutting through the moonlit swells. At 0300 hours, the Avenger above continued shadowing, radioing small course corrections. U-66 was on the surface. Diesel engines roaring, recharging batteries after 4 months at sea. Her crew was exhausted, her airfoul, her morale thin. They expected to meet a Milchkuh supply submarine, not an enemy. At 0308, 3 red flares arced into the sky, a recognition signal. The Germans believed Buckley was their rendezvous. Abel's lips twitched in disbelief. "Hold fire, keep closing." 4,000 yards became 3,000, 2,000, 1,000. Then, as the Americans closed within musket distance, U-66's lookouts realized the silhouette slicing towards them wasn't German. "Achtung! Zerstörer!" someone shouted. A flash burst from her bow tube. "Torpedo in the water! Starboard bearing!" "Hard left rudder!" Abel roared. Buckley heeled, foam spilling over her rails. The torpedo hissed past, close enough for men on deck to hear its propellers whining. Seconds later, it detonated harmlessly in the ship's wake. Range 2,000 yards. Open fire. The first salvo from Buckley's forward 3-inch battery roared. The rounds streaked over the water and smashed into U-66's forward deck, blowing her 88mm gun into a fireball. Her bridge erupted in sparks. Now every gun aboard Buckley joined in. 3-inch, 40mm, 20mm, even small arms fire from the bridge wings. The night turned white with tracer fire. The destroyer escort's gunners poured over 100 rounds of high explosive shells and thousands of cannon rounds into the submarine's silhouette. U-66 replied desperately with machine gun bursts, but most went high, whistling through Buckley's rigging. At 0324, the U-boat fired another torpedo from her stern tubes. "Fish off the stern," shouted the sonar operator. Abel yanked the helm hard to starboard. The torpedo foamed across their bow, missing by seconds. The range closed to yards, mere yards. The two ships were racing side by side now, their guns so close the tracers seemed to cross mid-air. Abel's voice cut through the chaos. "Keep hammering!" U-66's conning tower was burning. Flames licked through the railing. German sailors, faces ghostly in the firelight, tried to man their deck guns, but were torn apart by 20mm bursts. 16 minutes of continuous gunfire left Buckley's decks, littered with hot brass. The air reeks of cordite. Then the moment came when no more distance remained. "Range 20 yards," shouted the helmsman. Abel made a decision that hadn't been made in modern naval combat for a century. "Hard right rudder, ram her!" Buckley lurched. Her bow swung across U-66's course, metal shrieking as she climbed the submarine's forward deck. Sparks cascaded as steel met steel. For a frozen instant, the 1,400-ton escort literally rode atop the German U-boat. Engines reverse full. But before Buckley could disengage, shapes appeared in the firelight. German sailors climbing out of the burning conning tower, pistols and knives glinting in their hands. "They're boarding us," someone screamed. The order to repel boarders hadn't been shouted in the US Navy since the 19th century, but it echoed again that night. Men grabbed anything they could reach: Thompson submachine guns, M1 carbines, pistols, wrenches, shell casings. When those ran empty, they swung fists, boots, even coffee mugs ripped from the galley. A German petty officer leapt to the rail and was met by a sailor who cracked him across the jaw with a metal coffee cup. Another sailor hurled an empty shell casing like a club. The deck became a frenzy of brawling figures illuminated by burning tracer rounds. Below the bridge, a steward's mate named John Andrews found himself face to face with a German who had crawled through an open hatch, knife in hand. Andrews snatched the nearest object, a scalding coffee pot, and smashed it into the intruder's face. The man crumpled. For 2 furious minutes, modern naval warfare reverted to the age of cutlasses and fists. 36 Germans tried to swarm over Buckley's forecastle. Half were killed or wounded before they could retreat. Lieutenant Klaus Herbig, U-66's first officer, led the boarding attempt, hoping to draw American fire while Seehausen tried to free the sub. But the Americans outnumbered them, outgunned them, and outfought them. Abel shouted from the bridge, "Engines reverse, break free!" Buckley backed off, scraping down the submarine's hull, leaving 5 stunned Germans on deck who were quickly captured. Then U-66, still under power, swung around like a wounded animal and rammed Buckley in return. Her bow struck the destroyer escort's starboard quarter, tearing open the engine room and shearing off one propeller shaft. "Damage control report," Abel barked. "Starboard shaft gone, flooding in the engine room. Contain for now." As the ships parted, an American seaman glanced down into the open conning tower below them, pulled the pin on a Mk2 hand grenade, and tossed it inside. A flash. A roar. Fire belched from the tower like a blowtorch. U-66 shuddered violently. Her engines screamed, her bow dipped. The submarine began to circle, out of control, fire still burning in her conning tower. Men were jumping overboard. "Cease fire," Abel ordered. "Let her go." At 03:41 hours, U-66 slid beneath the Atlantic for the last time. Flames hissed out as sea water swallowed her. Her captain, Korvettenkapitän Seehausen, stayed at his post. 24 of his men went down with him. The battle had lasted 16 minutes. Buckley was left smoking, half crippled, and taking on water. 1 propeller gone, hull torn, engine room flooded. 550 miles from the nearest port. Yet she floated. 36 Germans bobbed in the water, some wounded, some stunned. Abel looked down from the bridge. These were the same men who had boarded his ship minutes earlier. His voice was steady. "Lower the boats, we're picking them up." The crew obeyed without hesitation. Tradition demanded it. You saved those who fought you once the fight was over. One by one, the enemy sailors were hauled aboard. Some had burns, others bullet wounds. All were exhausted beyond words. Dawn rose over a sea littered with debris and oil. The Atlantic was still again, as if erasing the chaos of the night before. Buckley's crew gathered on deck, silent, staring at the spot where U-66 had gone down. The smell of smoke clung to their uniforms. Chief Engineer William Dixon approached the bridge. "Sir, flooding's contained, but we've lost the starboard shaft completely. Port engine's still running, but she won't take more than 12 knots. Abel nodded. "Then 12 knots it is. Plot a course for New York." The engineer hesitated. "That's 2,000 miles on one screw." "Better than none." The radio officer handed Abel a fresh message. Confirmation that USS Block Island and her escort group would rendezvous within hours. The carrier's aircraft had been the ones that spotted U-66 in the first place. They'd provide cover on the long, limping voyage home. Abel stepped to the bridge wing. The sea breeze was warm, thick with diesel and salt. Behind him, his men were tending to the wounded Germans, offering water, cigarettes, blankets. Some of the prisoners stared at the Americans in disbelief, as though unable to comprehend kindness so soon after bloodshed. A boatswain's mate whispered to another, "You ever think you'd fight Krauts with coffee mugs?" The other man laughed weakly. "Hell, I didn't think I'd live to drink from one again." By noon, Buckley was steaming eastward at 12 knots, her patched hull groaning, her deck streaked with soot. The Atlantic stretched endless and empty ahead. The battle was over. The journey home had only begun. At 2:16 on May 6, 1944, Lieutenant Commander Brent Isle stood on the bridge of USS Buckley as an Avenger pilot radioed urgent coordinates. German submarines surfaced 20 miles ahead west of Cape Verde Islands. Abel was 34 years old, with 11 months commanding this destroyer escort, but Buckley had never faced a U-boat this close. The submarine ahead was U-66, the seventh most successful U-boat in the entire war. 33 Allied ships sunk, over 200,000 tons sent to the bottom. Abel ordered flank speed, 23.5 knots. Buckley cut through calm Atlantic waters under bright moonlight. Perfect conditions for a surface engagement. The Avenger stayed overhead, feeding course corrections every few minutes. U-66 was recharging batteries, waiting for a supply submarine. She'd been at sea since mid-January, nearly 4 months without resupply. Her crew was exhausted, low on fuel, desperate. At 0308, 3 red flares shot up from the submarine. Recognition signal. The Germans thought Buckley was their supply boat. Abel held fire, kept closing. 4,000 yards became 3,000, 2,000. The gamble worked until U-66's lookouts realized their mistake. A torpedo launched. Buckley turned hard left. The fish passed down the starboard side, missing by yards. At 0320, Abel opened fire. First salvo from the 3-inch guns hit U-66 forward of the conning tower. Direct hit. The submarine's deck gun was knocked out. All of Buckley's weapons engaged, 3 in, 40mm, 20mm. The U-boat returned fire with machine guns, but most rounds went high. Buckley's gunners hammered the conning tower, hit after hit. At 0324, U-66 fired another torpedo from her stern tubes. Abel saw it coming, turned hard right. The torpedo crossed ahead of Buckley's bow. Close. The range closed to 20 yards. Parallel course. Point-blank fire raked U-66 from stem to stern. The submarine's conning tower was on fire. Germans were visible through the flames trying to fight back, but Buckley's guns were overwhelming. 105 rounds of 3-inch shells, 2,700 rounds of 20mm, 418 rounds of 40mm, all in 16 minutes. What happens when a destroyer escort runs out of distance to shoot? Please hit the like button. It helps others discover these stories and subscribe. Back to Abil's decision at 0329. At 0329, Abel made a choice no destroyer escort commander had made in modern naval warfare. Hard right rudder ram the submarine. Buckley's bow rolled up onto U-66's foresail and stayed there. The two vessels locked together, steel grinding against steel. Then Germans started climbing out of the conning tower. Some carried pistols, some had knives. They swarmed onto Buckley's forecastle. The Americans thought they were being boarded. What happened next hadn't occurred in the United States Navy for over a century. Hand to hand, combat on the deck of a warship. Buckley's crew grabbed whatever they could find. Thompson submachine guns, M1911 pistols, rifles. But when those ran empty, sailors fought with fists, with 3-inch shell casings, with coffee mugs from the galley. One German made it inside the ship, reached the wardrobe. A steward's mate beat him back with a coffee pot. The fight lasted 2 minutes. Germans fell, Americans fell. Klaus Herbig, U-66's first officer, led the boarding party from behind the anchor windlass. He was trying to create a diversion, give his captain time to break free, but there were too many Americans, too much firepower. Herbig and his men shouted for surrender. Abel ordered engines reversed. Buckley backed away from U-66, leaving 5 armed Germans on deck. They were subdued immediately, but U-66 wasn't finished. The submarine came around under power, aimed directly at Buckley's starboard side. At 0335, she struck. The collision tore open Buckley's engine room, sheared off the starboard propeller shaft, twisted the stern. 16 minutes from first shot to sinking. Buckley's crew had just fought the only hand-to-hand battle on a US warship in World War II. 36 German survivors floated in the water, but Abel's ship was crippled, engine room flooded, 1 propeller gone, and they were 550 miles from the nearest port. The engine room was flooding. Water poured through the gaping hole U-66 had torn in Buckley's starboard side. Chief engineer reported the damage at 0345. Starboard shaft completely severed. Flooding contained but spreading. Port engine still functional. Abel had one propeller and 550 miles of Atlantic Ocean between his crippled ship and safety. But 36 Germans were in the water, some wounded, some in shock, all of them enemies 5 minutes ago. Abel ordered rescue operations. Buckley's crew pulled survivors aboard one by one, no hesitation. The same men who just fought hand to hand now hauled exhausted U-boat sailors from the Atlantic. Naval tradition. You save lives first, settle scores later. The rescued Germans were in bad shape. Many had burns from the fires inside U-66. Some had gunshot wounds from the close quarters fight. Others were simply broken. 4 months at sea, watching their submarine die beneath them, they were transferred to USS Block Island, the escort carrier whose aircraft had found U-66 in the first place. 24 German sailors went down with their boat, including Overlieutenant Zersgaard Jausen, U-66's commander. He stayed at his post until the end. U-66 had been a scourge of the Atlantic. Her record spoke for itself. 33 merchant ships sunk across 9 war patrols, over 200,000 gross registered tons, 8 American vessels among them. On January 16, 1942, she torpedoed the Canadian passenger liner Lady Hawkins. 246 people died. Civilians, Navy personnel, most never found. U-66 was one of 5 U-boats that launched Operation Drumbeat, the devastating attack on American coastal shipping in early 1942. Now she was gone, sunk by a destroyer escort that weighed 1,400 tons to U-66's 154. Sunk by a captain who'd been in command less than a year. Sunk in a fight that ended with coffee mugs and fists. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Germany's 7th most successful U-boat, defeated in the most primitive combat imaginable. But Buckley was barely floating. Abel assessed the damage as dawn broke on May 6. Port engine operational, steering functional, hull integrity compromised but holding. The starboard propeller shaft wasn't just broken, it was gone, sheared clean off. Every rotation of the port engine put stress on a ship designed for balanced twin-screw propulsion. Maximum safe speed 12 knots, maybe 15 if they pushed it. New York was the closest major repair facility over 2,000 nautical miles northeast. Boston Navy Yard could handle the damage, but that meant crossing the North Atlantic on one engine with a hole in the hull. The alternative was limp into a forward base in the Azores, but they lacked the equipment for major repairs. Abel made the call, set course for New York, hoped the weather held. Hope no other were hunting these waters. Task Group 21.11 reformed around Buckley. USS Block Island provided air cover. 2 other destroyer escorts took screening positions. They were exposed out here. Every German submarine in the Atlantic had heard U-66's last transmissions. Some would be curious, some would be hunting. A crippled destroyer escort made an attractive target. The damage control teams worked through the morning, shoring up bulkheads, pumping water, welding temporary patches over the worst holes. The engine room crew monitored the port engine constantly. Any failure now meant dead in the water, helpless. The Atlantic in May 1944 was still a war zone. The Allies were winning, but Hubert still proud, still hunted, still killed. By noon, Buckley was making 13 knots. Steady course. The hull patches were holding. But every sailor aboard knew the truth. They were lucky. U-66 could have put a torpedo into Buckley instead of ramming, could have disabled both engines, could have left them sinking instead of just crippled. The hand-to-hand fight made headlines later. The ram made history books. But the real story was simpler. Buckley survived because Abel had made the right decisions at the right moments, and because his crew had fought with everything they had, including the coffee mugs. Abel stood on the bridge watching the horizon. They had 6 days of slow sailing ahead, 6 days vulnerable, 6 days hoping the Atlantic stayed calm and the U-boat stayed away. His ship had just won the most unusual naval engagement of the war. But winning didn't mean safe. Not yet. Not with 1,500 miles still to go. The first 24 hours were critical. Buckley maintained 13 knots on one engine, steering a careful course northeast. The welded patches on the hull held, but the engineering crew monitored every seam. One failure could flood compartments faster than pumps could handle. The Atlantic was calm. No swells over 6 feet. That was luck. A storm would have torn the temporary repairs apart. On May 7th, Block Island's air patrols reported no submarine contacts within 200 meters. That didn't mean safety. U-boat could stay submerged for extended periods, surface only at night. By May 8th, Buckley had covered 300 meters, still over 200 to go. The crew settled into a rhythm. Damage control teams ran constant checks. Lookouts scanned for periscopes. Gun crews stayed ready, but word was spreading. Radio intercepts confirmed it. German Naval Command knew U-66 was gone. They knew how she died. Rammed by a destroyer escort, hand-to-hand combat on deck. The story seemed impossible. U-boat didn't get boarded. They sank from death charges or torpedoes. They went down fighting at range, not in close quarters brawls. But Buckley's action report was detailed, specific, undeniable. The coffee mugs bothered the Germans most. Official reports mentioned them 3 times. Ammunition expended included several General Mess coffee cups. That line appeared in the US Fleet Anti-Submarine Bulletin in June 1944. American sailors had thrown their breakfast dishes at one of Germany's most successful submarine crews. And it had worked. Some wounds on the German survivors were confirmed caused by ceramic impacts, coffee mugs, in naval combat in 1944. The hand-to-hand fighting lasted approximately 2 minutes. According to Buckley's action report, but those 2 minutes rewrote assumptions about modern naval warfare. Small arms fire accounted for 300 rounds of .045 caliber from M1911 pistols, 60 rounds of .30 caliber from rifles, 30 rounds of double buckshot from shotguns. Thompson submachine guns added more. But the close quarters weapons, fists, shell casings, coffee equipment, those were what made the story unforgettable. One detail stood out in the survivor interrogations. Klaus Herbig, U-66's first officer, had led the boarding attempt knowing it was hopeless. His goal was simple: create a distraction, give Jausen time to break the submarine free. Herbig and his men climbed onto Buckley's forecastle with pistols and knives. They faced rifle fire from the repair party, Thompson gunfire from the bridge wing, and when the Americans ran out of ammunition, they faced fists and improvised weapons. Herbig survived. He surrendered after realizing the diversion had failed. The German who reached Buckley's wardroom also survived. He had made it past the initial fighting on deck, found an open hatch, climbed down, thought he could sabotage something, find the radio room, maybe. Instead he encountered a steward's maid in the galley. The American grabbed the nearest object, a coffee pot, and beat the German back toward the ladder. Other crew members arrived. The German surrendered. Later, interrogation revealed he'd been aboard U-66 for all 9 patrols, survived depth charge attacks, survived aircraft strafing, but he couldn't survive a Navy cook with a coffee pot. By May 10th, Buckley was halfway to New York, 600 miles covered, 600 more ahead. The port engine was showing strain, oil pressure fluctuating, temperature running higher than normal. Chief engineer recommended reducing speed to 11 knots. Abel agreed. Better slow than dead in the water. They adjusted course slightly, aiming for calmer seas. The crew's morale was strange. They'd won an impossible fight, sunk a legendary U-boat, fought hand-to-hand and survived, but their ship was crippled. Every day at sea was a risk. Every hour the port engine ran was borrowed time. They celebrated quietly. No loud talk about the battle, just acknowledgement. They'd done something nobody else in the US Navy had done in over a century. Repelled boarders on a warship in the Atlantic with coffee mugs. On May 11th, a new concern emerged. The starboard side damage was worse than initially assessed. Saltwater corrosion was spreading faster than expected. The temporary welds were holding, but barely. Another storm would be catastrophic. Able checked weather reports constantly. High pressure system holding over the North Atlantic. Forecast stable for the next 72 hours. After that, nobody knew. And they still had 4 days of sailing ahead. 4 days hoping the weather held. 4 days hoping the engine didn't fail. 4 days wondering if another U-boat was tracking them right now. May 12th brought the first real test. Weather reports showed a low pressure system developing 400 meters northwest. Not a full storm, but enough to generate swells. 8 to 10 feet predicted. Buckley's damaged hull could handle 6, maybe 7. 10 feet would strain every weld. Able altered course slightly south, trying to skirt the worst of it. The swells arrived that afternoon. 8 feet rising. Buckley pitched and rolled. The temporary hull patches groaned with each wave. Down in the engine room the port engine laboured. Oil pressure dropped. Temperature climbed. Chief engineer reduced power. Speed dropped to 9 knots, then 8. The math was simple. At 8 knots, New York was 6 days away instead of 4. 6 more days exposed. 6 more days hoping nothing broke. By May 13, the swells peaked at 9 feet, close to the limit. Water seeped through 2 of the hole patches, not flooding, but steady leaks. Damage control teams worked in shifts, reinforcing, pumping, monitoring. Nobody slept much. The port engine temperature was climbing into the red zone. They needed to shut it down for maintenance. But stopping in the middle of the Atlantic meant drifting. Helpless. Able made another decision, reduce speed to 6 knots. Let the engine cool slightly while still maintaining steerage. It worked. Temperature dropped 5 degrees. Stayed there. But 6 knots meant 8 days to New York. 8 days of exposure. The mathematics of survival kept changing. Every hour brought new calculations, new risks, new decisions. Meanwhile, the story of U-66 was spreading beyond military channels. Navy public affairs officers saw the propaganda value immediately. American destroyer defeats legendary U-boat in hand-to-hand combat. Perfect morale boost. They wanted details, photographs, interviews. But Buckley was still at sea, still damaged, still vulnerable. The celebration would have to wait. The German survivors aboard Block Island were providing their version of events. Interrogation reports confirmed the basic facts. U-66 had indeed tried to board Buckley. Klaus Herbig had led approximately 12 men onto the American ship's forks. They'd encountered immediate resistance, small arms fire, hand-to-hand fighting. The coffee mugs were real. One German sailor had a facial injury consistent with ceramic impact. The medical officer's report was specific. Blunt force trauma, circular impact pattern approximately 3 inches in diameter, coffee mug size. What the Germans couldn't understand was why Buckley had rammed them. Standard destroyer escort tactics called for depth charges, hedgehog mortars, gunfire at range, not ramming. Ramming was obsolete, hadn't been used since the age of sail, but Able had closed to 20 yards, and the submarine was too close for most weapons. Ramming was the only option, so he'd taken it, and it had worked. By May 14th, Buckley had covered 900 meters from the engagement site, 300 meters to New York. The weather was improving. Swells down to 6 feet. Port engines stable at reduced power. The hull patches were holding. Barely, but holding. The crew allowed themselves cautious optimism. 3 more days, maybe 4. They could make it. Then the port engine oil pressure dropped again sharply. Chief engineer reported bearing damage, probably from the extended running at reduced power with asymmetric loading. The engine needed immediate shutdown for inspection, but they were still 280 miles from port. Too far to drift, too far to tow. Able ordered speed reduced to 4 knots. Absolute minimum to maintain steerage. The bearing held. Temperature climbed, but stabilized. 4 knots meant 6 more days, but 6 days limping was better than dead in the water. On May 15th, Block Island's air patrols detected a submarine contact 70 miles south of Buckley's position, possibly U-boat, possibly hunting. The contact submerged before aircraft could attack. Direction uncertain. Could be heading toward Buckley, could be heading away. Nobody knew. And Buckley was making 4 knots. A surface U-boat could do 18. If it was hunting the destroyer escort, Buckley couldn't run, couldn't maneuver, could barely defend herself. Able ordered battle stations and waited again. The submarine contact stayed submerged for 6 hours. Block Island's Avengers maintained patrol patterns, dropping sonar buoys, listening, tracking. At 1,800 hours on May 15th, the contact surfaced 60 miles south, moving west, away from Buckley, not hunting, probably heading to patrol stations further out. The threat passed, but it reminded everyone how vulnerable they were. 4 knots, damaged hull, 1 engine barely functioning. Easy prey. May 16th brought better news. Weather forecasts showed clear conditions for the next 72 hours. Calm seas. The port engine bearing was degrading but holding. Chief engineer estimated they could maintain 4 knots for another 4 days, maybe 5 if they got lucky. New York was 220 miles northeast. 4 days at 4 knots was 384 miles. They had margin, not much but some. Able received a message from Commandant, Commander Destroyer Force Atlantic. Buckley was front page news. The New York Times ran the story May 14th. Destroyer escort sinks U-boat in hand-to-hand fight. The Associated Press picked it up. Radio broadcasts mentioned it. The coffee mugs were the hook everyone used. American sailors defeat elite German submarine crew with breakfast dishes. It sounded like propaganda, but it was true. The Navy wanted Able and his crew ready for public appearances when they reached port. Speeches, interviews, photographs, war bond rallies.
February 1945, 20,000 feet over Germany. Ball turret gunner Staff Sergeant James Wilson's oxygen hose ruptures during a fighter attack. The thin air at this altitude gives him maybe 3 minutes of consciousness. But the hydraulics are damaged. His turret won't rotate back to the entry position. He's trapped inside a plexiglass sphere with oxygen running out, and the mission has 6 more hours to go. He survived. This is how, at 20,000 feet, the air contains about half the oxygen available at sea level. Your body cannot sustain consciousness. Without supplemental oxygen, you have roughly 60 seconds of useful consciousness before confusion sets in. Within 3 minutes, you'll pass out. Within 10 to 15 minutes without oxygen, brain damage occurs. Within 30 minutes, you're dead. Ball turret gunners depended entirely on oxygen supplied through a hose running from the aircraft's main system down through the narrow tunnel into the turret. The hose had to be long enough to allow the turret to rotate fully. But length made it vulnerable. Combat damage, sharp movements, or equipment failures could rupture or disconnect it. The emergency backup was a small oxygen bottle mounted inside the turret, a walk-around bottle designed to give you maybe 10 to 15 minutes of air if your main hose failed. Just enough time to get the turret rotated back to the exit position. Crawl out and connect to another oxygen source in the main fuselage, but Wilson's turret wouldn't rotate. The hydraulic lines that powered turret movement had been hit by the same flak burst that ruptured his oxygen hose. He could manually crank the turret using the backup hand crank system, but that took 15 to 20 minutes of exhausting work. His emergency bottle had maybe 12 minutes of oxygen. The math didn't work. Here's what made his situation even worse. The rest of the crew couldn't help him. The ball turret was a completely isolated position. Nobody could reach him from inside the aircraft while he was in the turret. To get him out, the turret had to rotate to align the entry hatch with the fuselage opening. Without hydraulics, only he could crank it into position from inside. If he passed out from oxygen deprivation while trying to hand crank the turret, he would die in that sphere and nobody could reach him, Wilson had one advantage most ball turret gunners didn't have: he'd grown up at high altitude in Colorado. His body had adapted to function on less oxygen than someone raised at sea level. This physiological adaptation, called hypoxic tolerance, meant he could potentially remain conscious slightly longer than the typical 3-minute window at 20,000 feet, but he also knew something critical from his training: oxygen deprivation affects your judgment before you lose consciousness. Hypoxia makes you confused, impairs decision-making, and creates euphoria that makes you think everything is fine even as you're dying. Hypoxia kills you by making you too confused to save yourself. Wilson made a split-second decision that violated every instinct. Instead of immediately switching to his emergency bottle and starting the desperate hand crank procedure, he stayed on the ruptured main oxygen line for another 30 seconds while he methodically checked every connection point in the oxygen system inside his turret. He was gambling that the rupture wasn't complete, that some oxygen was still flowing through the damaged hose, even if not enough to sustain consciousness indefinitely. Those 30 seconds cost him precious time, but the information was critical. If he could determine where the rupture was and how much oxygen was getting through, he could calculate whether he had any option beyond the emergency bottle's 12-minute limit. His gamble paid off. The main hose was partially torn, not completely severed. Oxygen was flowing, but at maybe 40% of normal rate. Not enough to sustain consciousness indefinitely, but enough to extend his useful time significantly if he could control his breathing and exertion rate. Wilson switched to his emergency bottle and immediately began the hand crank procedure to rotate the turret. But instead of cranking frantically, which would have burned through oxygen faster, he cranked slowly and deliberately. Every few cranks, he would stop, rest for 10 seconds, breathe slowly, and let his oxygen saturation recover slightly before continuing. This was counterintuitive. Every instinct screamed to crank as fast as possible before the oxygen ran out. But Wilson understood the physiology. Exertion burns oxygen. Panic breathing burns oxygen. Slow, controlled effort conserves oxygen. He was betting that slow progress with efficient oxygen use would get him further than fast progress with rapid oxygen depletion. After 8 minutes of careful hand cranking, Wilson had rotated the turret about 60 degrees, roughly halfway to the exit position. His emergency bottle gauge showed less than 3 minutes of oxygen remaining. The math was obvious. He couldn't complete the rotation before his oxygen ran out. He faced an impossible choice. Option 1. Continue hand cranking until his emergency bottle ran out, then switch back to the partially ruptured main oxygen line and hope the reduced oxygen flow would sustain consciousness long enough to complete the rotation. The risk was passing out from hypoxia before reaching the exit position. Option 2. Stop cranking now, switch back to the main hose, breathe the reduced oxygen flow, and wait for the aircraft to descend to lower altitude where the thin air wouldn't require supplemental oxygen. The risk was the mission might not descend for hours, and gradual oxygen deprivation would eventually cause him to pass out anyway. Wilson chose a third option nobody had trained him for. He used his emergency bottle to buy himself a detailed assessment of his exact physical state. He checked his pulse, elevated but not dangerously high. He checked his mental clarity by doing math calculations in his head, still functioning. He checked his field of vision, no tunneling yet. He was hypoxic, but not critically so. He switched back to the main line with the partial flow. The reduced oxygen hit him immediately, slight dizziness, a feeling of breathlessness. But he remained conscious. He resumed hand cranking, even slower now, stopping every 3 cranks to rest and breathe. His calculated bet was that the partial oxygen flow plus his hypoxic tolerance plus carefully controlled exertion would keep him conscious just long enough to complete the rotation. The crew and the main fuselage had no idea what was happening. Wilson's intercom connection had been damaged along with the oxygen and hydraulics. They knew his turret was stuck because they could see it hadn't returned to the stowed position. They assumed he was manually cranking it but had no way to know about his oxygen situation. At the 14-minute mark, Wilson felt euphoria beginning, the classic sign of severe hypoxia. His brain, starved for oxygen, was creating false feelings of well-being. This was the danger point. Hypoxic euphoria kills pilots and climbers regularly because it makes you feel fine even as you're dying, but Wilson recognized it. That recognition meant he still had enough brain function to override the false signals. He forced himself to keep cranking. 3 cranks, rest, breathe. 3 cranks, rest, breathe. His vision started tunneling, peripheral vision darkening. Another classic hypoxia symptom. He was maybe 60 seconds from losing consciousness. At 16 minutes, the turret clicked into position. The entry hatch aligned with the fuselage opening. Wilson unstrapped, disconnected from the main oxygen line, and crawled through the hatch on pure adrenaline with maybe 15 seconds of consciousness remaining. Hands grabbed him from inside the fuselage, pulled him through, slammed an oxygen mask on his face connected to the main aircraft system. Wilson regained full consciousness after about 2 minutes on good oxygen. Medical check when they landed showed no permanent damage. His calculated risk-taking and physiological understanding had saved his life. But the real story is what the Army Air Force learned from his survival. After Wilson's incident report, the Air Force modified ball turret oxygen systems on newer B-17 models. They added redundant oxygen bottles with independent supply lines. They improved the durability of oxygen hose routing to make ruptures less likely. They added quick disconnect fittings so a gunner could detach from a damaged line and switch to backup supply in seconds rather than fumbling with threaded connections. More importantly, they changed the training. Gunners were now specifically trained on hypoxia recognition, controlled breathing techniques, and calculated decision-making under oxygen deprivation. Wilson's slow hand crank method became part of official emergency procedures. The manual specifically instructed that if oxygen was limited, slow cranking with rest intervals was more effective than rapid continuous cranking. The modifications and training changes came too late for most of the war, but they influenced post-war military aviation. Modern military aircraft oxygen systems include multiple redundancies, automated backup systems, and sophisticated monitoring specifically because incidents like Wilson's proved that oxygen system failure in combat was a critical vulnerability. Wilson's survival came down to 3 factors. First, his physiological advantage from growing up at altitude gave him extra tolerance. Second, his understanding of hypoxia let him recognize symptoms and manage his condition. Third, and most important, his ability to override instinct and make calculated decisions under life-threatening stress. That third factor is what separates survival from death in extreme situations. Panic kills. Instinct often kills. Calculated risk-taking based on understanding your actual condition and resources, that's what saves lives. Wilson had maybe 16 minutes from oxygen failure to reaching safety. He used those minutes more effectively than someone with better equipment and more oxygen would have if they panicked. The ball turret was the most isolated, most vulnerable position on a B-17. But gunners like Wilson proved that even in that position, with equipment failures that should have been fatal, survival was possible through knowledge, discipline, and calculated decision-making. His 6 hours trapped at 20,000 feet, most of it on partial oxygen after his emergency bottle ran out, became a case study in how to survive the unsurvivable. At 4 o'clock hours on February 7, 1945, Corporal James Theodore Mackenzie crouched in a shell crater about 200 yards behind the American lines near Bastogne, Belgium. The cold was vicious, relentless. The thermometer had sunk to 14 degrees below zero, the kind of cold that stole your breath and made fingers feel like they belonged to someone else. Clutched in his gloved hands, a dented canteen cup held a crude mixture of axle grease and diesel fuel, sloshing faintly as he stirred it with a screwdriver. The plan he had meticulously devised over the past 3 weeks seemed insane. Impossible. And yet, in Mackenzie's mind, it was the only chance to stop the steel monsters rolling toward their lines. At just 22 years old, with 11 months of combat already etched into his face and 2 Purple Hearts pinned to his chest, Mackenzie had learned one hard truth: the war didn't reward patience or caution. It rewarded